Sorry about that 5 minutes, although I'm sure you all enjoyed chatting away for 5 minutes of your lunch break and not necessarily straight into the lectures. This is an intensive week. Welcome to UNSW. By way of introduction, I'm based here. I'm a member of the Centre of Excellence for Climate System Science, as well as the CCRC. And my actual field of research is the oceans, ocean circulation at the global scale and how it affects the climate system. I'm not going to talk at all about this today, but I think it's just nice if some person gets up and starts advising you guys on how to revise papers and review papers and all these things. You might know a bit about what I do. This animation would have been beautiful had my laptop worked onto the projector. I've got a group here of postdocs and PhDs, and some of them are in the room, but the kinds of things we do is look at the global scale circulation, how it affects the climate system, from Antarctica right up to the North Pole. And in that process we do develop models. We look at models of eddying resolution, right actually back to very basic models, box models, and very simple models that help us understand the system. We try to evaluate the best models there are with different traces, and I also have another life which is looking at modes of variability and like the Indian Ocean dipole or El Nino, the southern annular mode, and how those modes affect our rainfall. But as I said today, this is a session about skills, and so I'm going to get straight into that instead and talk about the topic that Melissa first came to me with was how to be a reviewer. And I came back to Melissa saying, you know, most PhDs don't get asked to review papers. Some of you will have been asked to do this, but many of you don't get to do this till you're outside of your PhD. And so I said, how about we talk about how to revise a paper once you get your comments back from the reviewer and the editor. You want to know how to go about that process. And then I realised, looking through the program this morning, for the full week, there's nothing about writing a paper, so I better touch on that too. So basically, that's going to be the outline of the talk. Writing, submitting a paper to a journal, revising a paper, this horrible process really. You write a paper and you know, 4 months later it comes back with comments and you think, well, where's this file that produced that graphic, and what was I thinking when I wrote that? And yeah, I hate this process. And then also I will touch on being a reviewer. I think if you understand how a reviewer thinks and how they work, it makes it easier to be somebody who revises a paper. And I hope to have time for Q&A, because I think this session would be boring if it lasted a full hour without me giving you folks a chance to ask me some questions. And so there's some journals that I aim for, you know, never here, never made it to there, and Nature Proper, never either. I've got one I'm writing at the moment, trying to hope for Nature Proper, but it's, you know, we aspire to those ones there, and we, you know, PNAS, and there's different ones here. Some of you might not know any of these journals at all because or not the ones on the top couple, like JPO was the one I really started off at, because I started off with physical oceanography, and these are all tough journals to publish in. You know, I think we're in a profession right now where reviewers are feeling like they can go hard on your paper and get away with it because we're in a rapidly expanding field. The Journal of Climate, for example, it started off in 1988. Its first edition came out. It had only, you know, one edition per month. Before they knew it, they were overwhelmed. They've got to go to 2 editions every month, and now they've got editions that are massively long. And it was the reverse. JPO, when I started out in the field, was a much bigger, grander journal, much more papers, much more prestige getting there. And it's all of the oceanography that relates to the climate systems going there. And I think, I mean, just to motivate this talk, I think we're in a tough field to publish papers right now. I get back review comments from reviewers, and the editors completely back their judgment, even when their judgment's actually a little bit out. The editors are sometimes, I'm not criticising the editors, but sometimes they're too rushed to scrutinise a review in detail, and so the process of revising your paper and addressing reviewer comments, I think, is all the more important now than it was 20 years ago, especially in this field that we're in, of climate research spanning the oceans, the land, the cryosphere, and so on. Okay, so just first up, writing a paper. You know, you could have there's going to be a 3-day session on this. in Sydney in July, sponsored by the COE, and do let Melissa know if you want to go in that course. It's a 3-day course, so I can't cover this in 3 minutes. But I like this slide. I got it from Pete Strutton. How many of you were at Pete's talk in Hobart last year? I think it was, okay, so there's a couple of you. Some of you, I heard it was such a great talk, and I pilfered some of his slides. I emailed Pete last night and said, can I have your PowerPoint show? It sounded like it was a good talk. But you'll have different words that go with the slides. And I've got lots of my own slides. Only about a third might be from Pete. But this is quite a nice little overhead, reminding you how to go about writing. My laser pointer's on its way, but the top dot point there is be really clear about what you can write up. I think we spend our time producing graph after graph. It's really important to take a step back and think about which 4 or 6 or 8 of the diagrams you've produced might make a paper. It's certainly not going to be every diagram you produce. I think if you publish 3% of the diagrams you produce, you're probably doing pretty well. A lot of analysis goes into your work before you get a paper, and so you've got to be clear about what you want to write about. Second dot point there is to devote time. Don't just assume the paper's going to get written because you've made the diagrams. You've really got to sit down and write. I tend to try to block out whole days to write these days. I try to just put a line through my diary and tell anybody who asks to see me I'm busy that day, because otherwise I'll never get around to writing. So devote some time. Here it says a couple of hours a day. Tailor that to your own needs. You might just want to write a couple of hours every couple of days, but do make sure you do it. Even if you're writing up notes on the diagrams you've produced, this will get you a thesis before you know it. If you don't do that, writing up a thesis can take a long, long time. If you get to towards the end of 3 years and say, hey, I'm going to start writing up all this stuff I've done. Keep at it. Don't go vacuum the house and think about what meal you're going to make. You that night sit down and try to write, and pick a good time of the day. It says there maybe first thing in the morning's good. Whatever time you think the clearest. Know your feature. This 4th dot point, there's a little bit. It's not my slide. It's from Pete Strutton. It says here, write proud. Try not to write. The point there is, I think that this is like painting a room. If you go into a room, the first thing, and you need to paint this room, and I did this actually during my graduate student years. Our scholarships back then were so low, we had to go and paint and all sorts of things. And I remember thinking of this analogy. When you write a paper, you really just want to get the text down there. In painting, just get the paint on the walls, and then go around and finesse the edges and touch up the bits that are important. The first thing to do is just get all the paint on the walls, and a thick coat's good. With your paper writing, don't be a perfectionist with every bit you write. Happily type away as quickly as you can, because you'll have time to go back and finesse it. Your co-authors will help you finesse the paper and so on. And this is this last point, getting feedback. And obviously, you'll all have a group of people. Some of you write with 2 or 3 authors. Some of you just, one person. But generally speaking, PhDs are submitting with other authors, whether it's your advisor or other collaborators. So make sure those authors work, because they're part of the paper. It's not just something you do in isolation. So what kind of things are important to get right in a paper? I think that actually from a reviewer's perspective, the title is incredibly important. I think you've all had this experience where you see a title alert in a journal and you think, wow, that paper is exactly what I need to read about, and you go look at the paper and there's nothing like what you thought would be there. Imagine if you're a reviewer and the reviewer said, come and read this, read this paper that's been submitted on this topic, and you've got this hope and that you're going to enjoy this. So make sure the title doesn't oversell your study, it doesn't undersell it. Of course, it shouldn't be 8 lines long. The abstract's obviously very important too, because that's the reviewer's first glimpse at your paper. And the abstract is an important thing. The abstract's all about, it actually is a self-contained document. It can be read without reading the paper. It says what you've done in the paper and what you've found. So just what you've done and what you found. 2 things to cover in an abstract. And I added, this is from Pete, I added another dot point here. He didn't have this in there. I think the introduction is incredibly important. And the reason I say that is that time and again I see reviewer comments come back where the reviewer has misunderstood the scope of what your paper is about. And what I mean by that is they've read your paper and they come back saying, why didn't you cover X, Y, and Z? And more often than not, in an introduction, you've set out the scope. But if you don't set it out clearly, and what I mean by that is you sometimes actually say what you don't do. So in your introduction you might say, we will not examine blah, 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 blah. And then the reviewer knows when they're reading the paper, they know not to expect that. So in some sense, a reviewer gets to this first, they get to see the scope of the paper, and this is crucial for setting their mindset as to what they're anticipating. I think a lot of reviewing comes down to what the reviewer is anticipating. If you sell too much in the abstract, if you sell too much in the title and don't clarify what you're going to cover in the introduction, disappointment can set in and you get a scathing review for an otherwise nice piece of work. I must admit I can't overstate this enough. Figures are just so important. They communicate our message. I think that most papers are a series of diagrams that just have some text going with it. I mean, often, probably for most of you, when you look at a paper, you just skim the diagrams to start with. That's your first, and many of us actually just look at the diagrams and judge for ourselves the results. So if your figures aren't clear and of high quality, you're underselling your study. It is so important to get them right. Nice big labels, nice bold colours. All my graduate students get frustrated with me for pushing this point because it is a hassle to go back and finesse diagrams. But it is so important. The references are particularly, Pete makes this point in his talk, and I think it's a very good one. Your references do provide the database for your reviewers. Now, of course, you shouldn't just avoid citing somebody who you think is going to be a bad reviewer, but be mindful of how you describe those people's pieces of work. It's all you can of course be critical of or point out blogs studied this, but they failed to take, or they did not take into account X. You just describe the past work. Don't be, don't praise every past study you've done for fear of getting a bad review, but be mindful that the references probably contain your future reviewers. Pick the journal carefully. I added to what Pete had here a few dot points. Think about your topic area. Obviously, the length of your paper. If you've got something with 25 diagrams, it's not going to go into GRL or Nature, although I should say those journals now have supplementary material, so you can still have a longer article within those high-impact journals. I think this is a good one, though. If you're publishing on a topic and all the past literature has appeared in a certain journal, that's a pretty good indication that's probably the right journal for you. Think about who your readers are going to be, and obviously I think, just down to the bottom points here, you really want your papers to have impact. You want your papers to be read by as many people in your community as possible, and so whatever study you've done, you really want to aim for the highest journal that you think you might succeed with. And that means, it does not mean going for Nature every time you write a paper, but it means looking at what you've got and thinking, what kind of impact is this going to have. I mean, your advisors, supervisors will generally have some good ideas about this, but you do want to maximise your impact. It sometimes means the paper appears 6 months later than if you went to a low impact journal, but in the end, your study will be read by more people. For some journals, cover letters matter. For Nature, this is just a slide from the editor of Nature where this is really not a cover letter. It just says here, I don't know why a cover letter is needed except some silly British protocol. That's not a good cover letter. I think for any journal, a cover letter is worth writing. It can be quite short. And the reason you do that is you sometimes set out reviewers that you think might be suitable reviewers. You might set out the scope of the study. The editor gets an impression through a cover letter of what your work's about. You'll highlight the main points of the manuscript. You might describe what's new. This is particularly important for the high-impact journals like Nature and Science. They only send out for review 10, 20, 30% of what they receive. Once you get it out for review, you've got a much greater chance in those journals. But I'd say even the discipline-based journals, if you get the editor on side with the nature of your study in a sort of conversational cover letter, this is very helpful. And I think suggesting reviewers helps. I'm stunned that journals take your advice on reviewers. I sometimes joke with some of my PhDs, let's nominate your mum. But they do, GRL in particular, take on your advice for reviewers. So it doesn't mean you're going to get any favours by those reviewers, but you've got a chance to suggest people who you think understand the topic. They're not prejudiced against the methods you're using. You want those sorts of reviewers, people who are contributors to your field, not in any way biased against, some people are just out to be against models, and so you don't want that kind of reviewer. If they've got a prejudiced view against models, they're not going to be very useful for assessing your paper.
Is there, because most journals these days, there's just this whole web submission system.
Yeah.
Is there scope for a cover letter?
That's right. So a lot of them are web-based now, and sometimes it says, any other documents to attach, and I think that's where you can do the cover letter. So not all journals will make this very easy. Some journals may like to avoid the cover letter because they think it establishes a connectivity that they don't want to encourage between the author and the editor. They want to keep those two folks separate. But I think if you can, having one is good. I mean, some of the ones we use just for the specialist journals like JPO and Journal of Climate are just straightforward, please find and close this paper. It has never been submitted to another journal. Thank you very much. It's just a simple sort of courtesy. British courtesy according to that previous. Okay, so just quickly, what makes a great paper? These dot points are from that Nature editor, Michael White. This guy's very powerful in our field actually. He vets all the Nature submissions and either sends them out for review or not. And so this is maybe not a bad set of slides or dot points to go from. I put my own ones in, my own choice of study. So 5 different things that makes a great paper, and then I'm going to talk about how you revise a paper from the reviewer comments. But things like discovery, so discovering something for the first time is clearly a great thing. This study was about finding out why Antarctic sea ice is expanding, and it turns out to be quite ironic that global warming is causing Antarctic sea ice to expand. You'll have to read the paper to understand why. But basically the fresh water from the land ice is stabilising the water column there, and that's allowing a really healthy freeze of seawater there because it's stable. Oceanography, let's not get there. The other sort of great paper is a major revision to our understanding, and this one back 10 years ago was looking at evidence for enhanced mixing over rough topography. Decades ago, people thought ocean mixing was relatively uniform. These guys came along and did some incredibly detailed measurements of ocean mixing and discovered orders of magnitude higher mixing over rough bathymetry. A landmark study revises our thinking to first order. Sometimes there are papers that just resolve a controversy, and in climate research at the moment, there are controversies being created outside of our own field, actually. And I see a lot of papers coming out. This one, for example, reconciling anthropogenic climate change with observed temperature over this period, came out a couple of years ago. Mike Mann's there, the author of the hockey stick paper, and others. And this is basically a paper motivated by misinformation by people outside of the scientific community. So, is it a controversy? Well, it's certainly one in the public's mind. It's not one necessarily in the scientist's mind, but it's still a very valuable contribution because we are engaging across our discipline and out into the community with the work we do. Sometimes papers are just simply timely and of immediate relevance. This is a nice one on the 2011 La Nina. It was so strong that so much rainfall was dumped over the land that sea level actually dropped for that La Nina event. I found that a staggering result, but it's clearly of immediate interest because, again, people with vested interest were sort of saying, hey, look, sea level's suddenly going down, the world's going into an ice age, whatever they were saying, and this nice paper came out and said, hang on a second, let's just note the fact that the rainfall's been so heavy that there's still a lot of water in the groundwater system making its way back out into the ocean. And sometimes studies, and I reckon I'm writing one of these at the moment with a couple of people in my group, it's really not a surprising finding, but it's maybe an important quantification. It sort of goes through something that's kind of known, but maybe not synthesized in a useful way. And this is a great example of this paper by Malte Meinshausen a couple of years back, talking about this, global emissions targets for warming the planet at under 2 degrees C. Really stuff that the community knew, but synthesized in a way that nobody had done so before. So this is a very nice study. I do want to get on to talking about revising and reviewing papers. Just quickly, titles are important. I think you can try to make them shorter and shorter generally, but sometimes you go too far, and you might want to sort of go back to the dates that you analysed for. It's a balance. You don't want to get. I think less is more is certainly the case, but again, you don't want to overstate your work with an inaccurate title. So make your titles accurate, interesting, not too specific, or regional. Maybe catchy if you're going for one of those high impact journals, but I think you shouldn't overstate. You shouldn't make it so broad that the reviewer gets to your work and is kind of disappointed to see the limited scope. Okay, now back to the topic that Melissa and I first chatted about having here in this lecture on skills is basically what happens. You've submitted your paper, 3 months has gone past, maybe 6 months sometimes. It's horrendously long sometimes. You get the reviews back. How do you respond? How do you work well with your co-authors in that process? How do you get the desired outcome? I mean, this is, as I said at this very start of the lecture, this is a hard process, and I think it's hard to keep going back to again and again. And you want the paper to be published. There's nothing worse than submitting a paper and it hanging in no man's land for years because you just can't get around to revising it successfully. Just to summarise the kinds of things you get back from an editor, there's 4 main dot points. Except as is, this never happens. Unless it's a dodgy journal. There was a great case a couple of years back where some climate scientists submitted a synthetic paper. There are programs you can go to on the web that just create, it's just a complete, what's this expression, gobbledygook or something? I can't say that properly, but it's just a series of sentences talking about kryptons and neurons and photons, and there's diagrams with graphs that look sensible, and it's meaningless, absolutely meaningless stuff. And they submit it to one of these journals that purports to be a journal that's reviewed, and it's actually a front for some of these industries against climate science, and these papers get accepted as is, and it's quite a scandal. But so any credible journal, it will never be accepted as is. I think that's a very valid statement. I think some of us sometimes get a paper that a comment coming back which is miraculous, saying this is great, like it, but please clarify these 6 points. It just you can't have something that's perfect on submission. Maybe it happens 1 in 1,000 times. Minor revision. This is beautiful. You want this. It might not even go back to the reviewers. In this case, your response document is crucial. I'll come back to that in a minute. Major revision. Sometimes the journals say this paper is rejected. And again, do talk to your supervisor. Some journals like GRL say rejected, even Journal of Climate these days. Can I tell you a bit about why this has occurred? It changed about 8 years ago when a lot of the journals were concerned that the byline would say, paper submitted, 1st of January 2007, accepted in final format, 2009, published 2011. They had these terrible metrics there. And they decided, let's just start calling this a rejection. In fact, some journals call this a rejection. Your paper is rejected in its current format. But it may be resubmitted subject to satisfying some... And you see this rejection comment, and you go down and look at the comments, and they're saying this is a great paper and it should be published. So do read through all of the reviewer comments. Journals like GRL call this a rejection, they call this a rejection, and of course this is a rejection. So every paper's rejected. Of course they can then say, 70% of our submissions are rejected. We're a high impact journal. I'm not being critical of those journals too much. I'm just pointing out that they do like to have high impacts. They do like to say that they publish only a selection of what's submitted to them. And so it's skewed everything down to sounding terrible. The editor's cover letter sounds terrible. Your paper's rejected, and that's a horrible word. You pour your heart and soul into a paper for a year and it comes back rejected. But generally speaking, I think most fall into these two categories, although I got the stats from GRL, it's 30%, and Nature, it's 93%. So plenty go into this category, never to be submitted again, do not come back. Of course, sometimes you can rework that in major ways, and all is not lost necessarily in that last category. But most of you will get these two, and in both cases this response document is crucial. Reviewer comments span a great range. They can come back with glowing endorsement, a few minor clarifications, or really horrendous. This is as bad as I've seen. I also note there are 10 authors listed for this paper, and it's surprising none have picked up on what seems to be obvious area. Ouch, yeah. So that's the good and the bad, and there's certainly ugly out there as well. But I'll come back to how to respond to those reviewer comments in a minute. Just quickly, you can, just back to the editorial level, you can challenge the editor's decision. So what I mean by that is sometimes reviewers, so especially this one here, editors can see some review comments that seem to be damning to them, and actually they just put it in this category and tell you it's rejected, and they don't think that a revised version would even be suitable for the journal. And in that case, we had this happen a couple of months back. There was a paper about the Modoki, the El Nino Modoki. Some of you have heard of this. It can either be an East Pacific El Nino or a Central Pacific El Nino. And one of the reviewers just said, I don't think they should be talking about these two different El Ninos. They're not really distinct modes of variability, and therefore the paper should be rejected. And actually all we were doing was looking at what the El Ninos look like in the CMIP 5 models, whether the warmest temperatures in the ENSO were in the Central Pacific or whether they were in the Eastern Pacific. There was no a priori need for these two modes to be separate. The reviewer had a prejudice against the El Nino Modoki, even though it's been the subject of hundreds of papers. But even if El Nino Modoki wasn't a separate mode to ENSO, the paper didn't rely on that, if you like. That premise wasn't an assumption that justified the paper. And so we went back to the editor and made a case, and it was really stunning to me, because the editor went from saying, one reviewer found the paper to be interesting and actually accepted with minor comments. However, the second reviewer has picked up an inconsistency with your research, and this is a flaw that means the paper's rejected. And we went back and argued against that, and we didn't just get the chance to resubmit, but the editor said, I agree, that reviewer is prejudiced and will discard their comment. So do think about challenging the editor's decision. If you really think it's wrong, obviously consult with your co-authors, see if the reviewer's comments, if they are wrong, point out why they are wrong. I think the key thing here is to write the letter carefully, and you might need to address, in that case we had one sticking point we had to address, and we didn't write a 6-page letter. It really was down to probably within a page or so, just addressing what was perceived to be the flaw of the study. You've got to remain civil, though. It's very tempting to bash your keyboard and get right emphatic terms. Remain dispassionate, even though you are passionate about your science, just remain dispassionate. Okay, so that's the editorial level, particularly important for Nature and Science and PNAS and even GRL, to think about challenging the editor's decisions. There was a study done recently that showed that papers that had been rejected in some of their lifetime, so if you think of trace the life of a paper from writing through submission through publication, papers that had been rejected had a far greater chance to be high impact papers than ones that were never rejected. And that just tells me that all of the high impact journals tend to make your progression through to publication pretty hard. You've got to sometimes go back and argue your case again and again. Okay, now if you're in the lucky position that you've got a chance to respond to your reviewer comments, the editor has said to you, here are the comments, please come back and tell us how you've changed the paper. I found this very nice, these slides will be on the website, I'll give them to Melissa by the way, and I'll put this paper here. He's actually a clinical chemist, but I came across this paper a while back, and it really, it applies to any field of science, and it's quite a nice read. So I'll just go through the 10 tips that he came up with. First one, get mad, then get over it. It's not, don't start writing your response letter the day you've got the response letter. Read them, take a deep breath, grab a coffee, go for a swim, whatever calms you down. And try to get over it. It's hard sometimes. You work for a year, the reviewer works for sometimes only a couple of hours to maybe write a bad review, if it was bad. That doesn't mean you should go and express your rage in the letter, and consider what the decision letter really says. So this comes back to what I said earlier, where it says it's rejected. Okay, read through the text, and there below where he or she has said it's rejected, the editor said, however, I think the paper may be published after you. So it's rejection in its current form, which I think pretty much everything we submit is rejected in its current form, isn't it? Except when you finally get it accepted after sometimes 2-3 rounds of reviews. Wait and gather your thoughts. I think this is a good one. I tend to, everybody I work with papers, I really like to just start actually with the response letter. I find it hard, if you go in and start addressing the manuscript text immediately as you're going along, I think you tend to sometimes, you can do more work than you need to do. Because sometimes the response letter, you can actually address 70% of the comments really well, and clearly 10% you kind of half address them, half not, kind of clarify why you're not going to address them. And maybe you can even counter 20% of them. You can actually explain, this is a good point, but that's beyond the scope of this paper for this reason. You can wriggle your way out of that extra work. I think it's worth doing the response letter even before you touch the manuscript, because it means that you save time. You do the whole process first. Even if the reviewer is wrong, it doesn't mean you're right. And so this is a really important point. Sometimes you see comments that are wrong, and the best way to address those isn't to go back and say you're wrong, because you antagonize them and they can strengthen in their resolve, and it just creates the wrong vibe all round. I reckon generally if they've gotten something wrong, and this is assuming they've read the paper completely, to be fair, because I think sometimes there's evidence a reviewer might not have done that, but let's give them the benefit of the doubt, they've read the paper completely. If they've got something wrong, it means that they've misinterpreted what you've written. It means you probably can be clearer in how you describe something. It means you might have to go back to the introduction and explain that such and such isn't part of the scope of the study. So don't view an incorrect comment as something that's irrelevant. It might just indicate you haven't expressed something as clearly as you might have. And I think this relates to something I said previously, choose your battles wisely. If a reviewer is advocating for the addition of a word in a sentence, and it's kind of could go either way, I don't know, like you want to stick to what you believe is right. I wouldn't like to say don't paddle over that word, because that word might mean a lot, but do try to respond to as much as you can. If you're going to go into battle on a point, I think it needs to be one that really is worthwhile. It's a sticking point that you fundamentally disagree with them on. You've got to make a case for this. You can't just say that they're obviously incorrect on this point. You want to back that up with evidence. This is an interesting one that counts. Don't start saying, well, reviewer 1 said this and then reviewer 3 said that, but reviewer 2... I mean, I find it tempting to do this, I must admit, because there are cases where one reviewer of 3 or 4 raises a point that none of the others do, and I don't mind that sort of comment that says, this point wasn't raised by reviewers 2 or 3. I mean, that's probably getting about as close to this as you'd like. I think you want to avoid language that sounds adversarial in any case, but to me, this is the one point of these 10 dot points that this chemist wrote that I kind of wavered on, because I think there are sometimes, if the other 2 reviewers haven't raised a point that the 3rd reviewer has, you've got to wonder why that's the case. Is it because it may not be relevant, because not every reviewer will pick up every issue that needs to be picked up, but I'm a bit, I'm not so convinced that that is something to avoid. I just think you need to pick the language carefully. It's good to be great. I mean, the reviewers have usually put in valuable time into this to read your paper. They are contributing to the science you produce. They probably make the paper better in time. I think it's good to be grateful for their time. I think acknowledging them, for example, is good. Even if it's a brutal review process, you probably look at the paper once it's finished and go, that's better than what I submitted. And so they've contributed to your science. They're never going to be co-authors with you, but they've contributed to their science, the science you've done. And so it's good to be appreciative, but not too sycophantic. It's terrible when you see response letters where it gets too much maybe into this. But I don't know whether you can, but I think a lot of reviewers just like you thanking them, and that makes them feel better about their time, which is an important thing to obviously to get right. In the response letter, this is a bit of technical detail here. This is just an example from one of my postdocs. Here's the comments from the reviewer. Now here's the sycophantic. Not really. We thank you for the comment, although we blah blah blah. So the response then follows. But what I mean, the reason I put this up here is just to say, make sure you put all of the reviewers' comments there in full. Don't start editing them. I have seen cases where people think, gosh, they've written a whole page of comments, and really it's just down to this one point. That's not good to do, because the reviewers rely on reading the complete review of the other reviewers. You can say at the very start, the following comment relates to this point, and that's a very clear statement, and then you have the whole page of their comments, and then you have your response. But do verbatim, word for word, copy paste the entire review comment into your response letter, and then have your comments follow. And I think this, whether you italicize one or not the other or whatever, use some way to delineate the reviewer comments from your responses. You might have a little response thing here underlined, but every single comment, no matter how small, and even sometimes it's just typos, you just say done. This is misspelled, corrected, whatever. It's a thorough. It tells the editor you've been thorough. It doesn't take you too much extra time. Sometimes you can use a different font. For example, here Laurie basically, where she's added text in the review, this is her response, and then whenever she added text to the paper, this is in a different font. So really, the response letter is incredibly clear to the editor. This is still under review with PNAS, and an unusual review process again. Just one reviewer. We're battling to get this back into the system, and hopefully that detailed response letter will help. Be prepared to cut text. This is, for your thesis, you can just cut the text and save it in a file and bring it back into your thesis, which is generally a much longer version of your papers. But for the paper itself, don't think to yourself, this paragraph took me a day to write, I've got to keep it in there, no matter what. Be prepared to shorten text. The papers that you write in the journals are just glimpses to the study you've done. It's never going to be everything you did in terms of diagrams, and sometimes not the text you've written. So be prepared to cut text. And this is a good one to take note of. Don't submit the same paper unchanged to another journal. The chances of a reviewer getting it back, and I've seen this happen, is pretty good. And then they really can't stand this. They, why are you sending this back to the journal unchanged? If you revise it, of course you should send it to another journal. And I think in that case, it's pretty good to say to the editor, this was previously, especially if it's a high impact journal like Nature or Science or PNAS or whatever, this was previously submitted to X. Following review or comments from that journal, we're now. I think it's better to be open up front. You don't want your colleagues to get your paper across several different journals and get really annoyed. I think I've covered all these points. You want things to be clear so everybody's happy. It speeds up the process. Yeah, it's all been covered. Here are 3 golden rules. If you drifted off for the last 10 minutes, Rule 1, I think this is probably the most important, followed by this one down here, Rule 3. Rule 1 is to answer completely. Like I said, copy-paste the entirety of the reviewer comments into your response document and then answer those point by point. Do answer with evidence, either by explaining how this is covered in the paper or that some other study has covered this or whatever it is, but always answer with evidence rather than opinion. And then lastly, the third is, do answer politely. And sometimes reviewers are rude, actually. This is kind of frustrating. They can be rude to you, but it's good just to come back to them dispassionately, calmly. I wouldn't tend to say, we thank you for this comment if it's been incredibly rude, but try to remain less than emotional when you respond. Okay, I've covered this really already. This is sort of how to set out response letters. I guess the point here is, don't just say done. If it's a comment that is of substance, add your discussion, and then you might add in here they've underlined, some extra text that's been put into the paper. That comes back to what I said previously about how to set out your response letter clearly with the reviewer comments, your response, and then how you've changed the manuscript text. Okay, almost finished. I want to give you some time for Q&A. Just really quickly, I thought about, there's so many things that can be covered in this sort of session. So hopefully the end result is publication. This is great. You get the acceptance letter. It goes to the publishing house that prepares the document for publication. What do you do then? Well, I reckon you've got to maximise the impact of your work. Alvin Stone was here before us. He's still there. The second dot point we'll get to in a second. But just quickly, I really advocate this. Don't be shy about emailing out your paper to your colleagues and to people that you don't know, who you know are working in the area. Sometimes you might, if you've got 4,000 email addresses in the to header, maybe make it a BCC so you don't have all the addresses, because then the people feel quite special. Maybe there's only 3 people who were sent it. But I advocate this really strongly, especially for Australian-based researchers. We're not in Europe and we're not in the US, where there's almost a 10-fold increase in the number of people just working in our science areas in that geographic range. So the importance for Australian research, I think, is even more to get this out internationally. Send it to colleagues. If you've cited them, this is a great line. Dear colleague, please find attached a paper recently published, blah blah blah. We found your work valuable, and it's like, and then they read it. What have they said about my paper? You force people to read your paper. Worst case scenario, your paper is only ever read in all of its lifetime by you, the co-authors, the reviewers. That's not many people. You want more people to read it. This helps a great deal. This second dot point helps a great deal, and Alvin can talk more about this. I think there's a session on media coming up. One of the highest impact papers I've ever seen come out of a PhD project was Carolyn Ummenhoffer's work on the International Dipole and the Southeast Australian drought. It came out miraculously a week after the bushfires down there. It was all over the press for a week, and Caroline, whenever I see her, she still marvels at the citation rate for this. It's going up to 200 sites pretty quickly. Only published 3 or 4 years ago. It was all over the press globally, and so it really meant that scientists read the paper, and she got way more impact for that than if it was just buried in that journal, hoping that people would see the alerts. I reckon these 2 things are the biggest ways you can make your paper push it out to the community, because scientific colleagues do look at the press. I mean, they read papers and they read online websites like New Scientist and even all the major papers these days publish work about published science, especially in the climate area. So I'd take advantage of this. And the last dot point that I'd add to these 2 here is, don't be shy about presenting your work at meetings. I've often heard people say, but I published this already, it's appeared, I shouldn't show the slide at a meeting. And I think this is really underselling your work. Nobody reads the journals cover to cover. If you line them up, JGR journals in the 60s, there were this much reading to be done across all of the sciences: planetary, Earth, solar, blah blah blah, atmosphere, oceans. I mean, JGR, there's a great slide of this. JGR now, for publishers, everything that published in a year, it actually takes up about 10 metres worth of length. Nobody can read all the papers unless you go to the meetings, and sometimes that work's 4 years old. You still, it's the motivating slide. You're giving a talk about something else that followed that study, but don't be shy about putting up a slide from a study 4 years ago. The number of times people miss your work, and again, just anecdotally, an example of this, I was a little bit annoyed. Something we wrote a few years ago just never got cited. And I started going to meetings and sneaking it in there and saying, this work we did, I don't know why people didn't notice this, but here it is. And and before I knew it, it went from 0 sites, and now it's, at least it's gotten 50 or 60 sites. I'm sure showing it at work meetings meant that people bothered to go and find out what we've done. Okay, last topic, and I'll cover this in a couple of minutes if I can. Reviewing a paper. I mentioned at the very start here that I think this is not normally something that you... Just show of hands, who's been asked to review a paper already in their PhD year? So, yeah, about sort of 15% of the room. It might happen towards the end of your PhD, or if you've been established in the field for a while. So it'll happen sooner or later anyway. And I don't think it's something that you should avoid as a PhD student. I think it's something that's good to start doing at any stage, and you can bounce the review off your immediate supervisor or somebody, a colleague you trust. I think that's generally approved by the journals. You've got to be very discreet about this. You can't send the journal off, the article off to 8 people for it's got to be a confidential. That process of peer review has got to be respected, but it's absolutely fine. And I think the editors encourage PhDs to bounce the review process off their immediate advisor. Think about how many you might do. Sometimes you think, gee, I'm being overwhelmed by reviews, but for every paper you submit, 3 reviews are needed, sometimes 4. Of course, you might have 10 authors, so you've got to scale by, not all 10 authors would then review 3 papers, but if you divide the number of authors on your papers, an author-weighted index of your publications, you should do 3 times that many reviews. So you will have to review at some stage. It's part of being in the profession. I'd make sure the topic matches your expertise. There's no point in reviewing something that's outside what you feel capable to review. So do say back to an editor, this is not in my area of expertise. They're getting overwhelmed by publications right now, and you can get stuff in the lower impact journals. It's just trying to find a reviewer somewhere. And really, I think it's okay to decline a review, especially based on this, because that's the idea of the review process. It is expert review that's required, not inexpert review. So make sure this is the case. When I review, I think the 2 main benchmarks I look at, and I must admit I'm a generous reviewer. I wish I'd had myself as a reviewer. I think if I look at I don't know how many papers I've reviewed, but I would say that ultimately virtually every single paper that I've been involved with reviewing is published. There's always, pretty much always a way for that paper to be revised, to be published. And my two main benchmarks, I think, is the methodology sound for the problem at hand? If the methodology is flawed, then of course it shouldn't be published. But and if it's incomplete, maybe they need to make it more complete. And then, are the advances significant? It's all, it needs to be something that's basically new. And generally papers do one of these 2 things. This advancing here might be quite incremental. It may not be a major advance, but unless it's a nature science type journal, the advance can be relatively minor. It just needs to advance the field in some way with a sound methodology. I'll skip over this slide. This is basically what to do and what not to do if you're a reviewer. Basically, these are the good things to do. Yes, complete your review. This is put together by Bart in 2010. They love you if you're on time and you give a good review. Actually, they quite like you if you're too busy, but you suggest alternatives. And then there's progressive scales of dislike. I mean, the worst thing is to never submit a review, or to submit reviews that are conflicted, incomplete. I once got a review, I shouldn't give these personal examples, but why not? It said something like, this is a paper about a scientific topic, and it is a paper and it can be accepted. I mean, this was not a review. I don't even know why the editor sent it to us. It really was 3 lines, basically not saying anything, except it's a paper. So those sorts of reviews should be just discarded by the author, by the editors. Actually, I'm running out of time for Q&A, so let's just finish this off. How to review a paper? I'll leave this. Melissa will put this up on the website. I think basically skimming it to see if it's published. I mean, you don't want to read a whole paper cover to cover when there's a flawed methodology. And then once you read it, I think just read it, scribble on the manuscript. I like, circle stuff, question mark. And then when you go through it again, just write up a review. So this sort of sounds like you read it 3 times. I think really you skim it once and then you read it thoroughly once, annotating the manuscript, and then you can write up a review, which is kind of like a forced way to read it a second time. You can sign your reviews. I think that's a useful thing. I think by default you should try to sign your review, but don't if you feel like there's potential conflicts. I might skip this and just go to Q&A. Thanks so much. I've got only 5 minutes till Claudia starts. So any questions or comments? Yeah.
What do you do if you had 2 reviews that actually disagree on a topic? Like, how do you choose which one to go with?
Yeah, that's a tough one. If they've got 2 different points, I mean, the editor's partly responsible for resolving that. They can go to a 3rd reviewer to resolve it. You want to choose the one who you agree with, obviously, and then back that up with evidence. But I don't think it's the other reviewer will see so reviewer A will see that reviewer B disagrees. So I don't think you should play too much about reviewer B's comments. I think you're best addressing the topic with your own evidence and your own lines of argument, and reviewer A will know that and often the editor's letter will come back saying there's a split decision. So I think you can plan it a little bit, but I wouldn't do it too much because everybody gets to see the other reviews.
A very good method to it on the corresponding author. Some supervisors like to do corresponding author, but others.
Yeah, so my advice is that, my personal view is that the only time that corresponding author I think it should always be the lead author. That's my personal view. I think the only time it should ever not be the lead author, we had an honours student a couple of years ago who wrote a paper for Journal of Climate, which is really rare, and we tried to lure him into a PhD program, and he decided to go and just work, and he was wavering on whether to come back to the field, and obviously he's not going to be a corresponding author because he's going to leave the field. But my personal view, and I don't want to undermine what supervisors are saying, is that it generally should be the lead author in almost all circumstances, except when the lead author is going to be leaving the profession in some way, or if, say, there's a methodology or a technique that's controversial and that one of the other so there must be some really extenuating circumstances for it not to be the lead author, in my opinion. Yeah. Hamish. Yeah, no, that's a very good point. I think that, Hamish's point there is really that any paper, even the papers that appear in this is what science is about. The papers that appear in the journals will then be read by people and they'll be criticised by people, and people will think this was not really valid because they should have done X, Y, and Z. So I think this issue is that no matter what version of the paper you get to, it's always going to be one that's open for comments and criticism, and I think the editor's job there is to make sure they navigate that piece either back for more revisions. That's why the editor's job is so important, actually, because they basically control that process. They decide when the review process has gone long enough for it to go into publication. If it's poorly managed, a review can go on forever, and you're into 3-4 reviews, and this is not so good. But I think it's a matter of coming back and stating your case as best you can, and hoping the editor's able to manage the process, or that the reviewers are reasonable enough to see that the paper is sound in its methodology and advances the field in a significant way.
If you publish work and then you're sitting and ask people to be overseas to have subscribe to that journal, asking for a copy of the paper, are you in a position to give them that with the copyright and the like?
Is this being recorded? If you go to my website, every single thing I've ever written is in a PDF. Yeah, don't tell anybody. I've heard of people getting contacted by journals and saying, this paper's there, especially something that's been. Stefan Ramsdorff wrote a paper a couple of years ago in ERL, Environmental Research Letters, just saying what the models have done and what the observations have done recent decade or two. It's been downloaded 30,000 times. Right now, if that was in a journal that asked for somebody to pay $20 to see it, 30,000 times $20 is a lot of money. So I think it varies. I would never go on the record as saying you should post every PDF. But for me, you want to disseminate your research. If you Google any paper, you'll pretty much find its PDF somewhere. I tend to put them on my website. I think it's something you shouldn't publicise, though, that you do that. The more people that read your paper, the better it is for you. If you like, you can